All right, it's 8 o'clock GMT, and I'm pleased to welcome Rich Bang on VSA Online. And today we will listen an exciting talk on a non-Hebbian code for episodic memory. So, without any further delay, Rich, please.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Thanks to Evgeny for giving me this opportunity. I unfortunately have not been able to attend as many of these seminars as I would have liked to in the past, but it is certainly very cool to see the community around this very interesting topic and how it's grown over the last few years. And I'm very excited to be able to tell you about some of my work today, which will be about a story about episodic memory, and in particular, a coding scheme for episodic memory that challenges kind of the traditional Hebbian theory associated with this process in the brain. And so first, I just want to thank my collaborator for this project, Stefano Recanatesi, who just started his own lab in Technion University in Israel, in case anyone is looking for a neuro AI postdoc in a very cool lab. And I also want to thank our various funding sources and the spaces that provided, or the institutions that provided space and coffee that made this project a reality. So to begin, I want to introduce two mathematical fun facts that will probably be very familiar to this audience, but I just wanted to be explicit about them since they are quite fundamental for everything that follows. And the first one is that high-dimensional random vectors are almost orthogonal, at least with very high probability. So if you open up Python and sample two very large vectors with IID elements, and you can do this with Gaussian IID elements or sparse binary vectors and various other types of IID distributions, you will almost certainly find that the dot product between two of these vectors is very close to zero, and it will get closer to zero as the dimensionality of these vectors increases. And that's a fun little exercise. It's not too difficult to prove. And as an aside, for large n, for very high dimensionality, there are in fact exponentially many almost orthogonal vectors in Rn. And this is very distinct from the n perfectly orthogonal vectors. So if you're willing to be almost orthogonal, you gain a lot of expressivity. And this makes high dimensional random vectors a very good code book because you are not going to run out of distinguishable code words anytime soon. The second fact, which follows from the first one, is that subsets can be encoded as sums of high-dimensional random vectors. And I think most of us were kind of blown away by the first time we saw this fact, including myself. So say for the sake of argument, we have a set A, B, and C, and a corresponding codebook of code words RA, RB, and RC, which are these high-dimensional vectors. If we want to encode the subset A and B, what we can do is simply sum RA and RB into a trace W, and this will encode approximately the subset A comma B. And the way we then pull these elements or these items back out of this vector is the following. So if we want to check whether A is in this subset, we take the dot product of RA with our memory trace W, and we will find that the first term goes to 1 if we've normalized things correctly. The second term goes to 0. And so the total dot product equals 1. And therefore, A is included in this set. On the other hand, if we were to check an element C, we do the same thing, but we find that both terms go to 0. And so the result is that this dot product is 0. And that means that C is not included in this set. So this is kind of the basis for almost everything high-dimensional computing and VSA. And it's also very related to a data structure in computer science called a Bloom filter, which actually works in basically the same way. It has very wide application for set membership query operations like storing URLs and checking whether you've seen a spam URL in the past or not. And there's a lot of space efficiency benefits to that sort of data structure. And I also want to give one more bonus fact, which is that summing high-dimensional vectors is in fact a highly neuromorphic, or rather highly compatible with things that might happen in the brain. And as a specific example, although there are others, One example is short-term potentiation in the hippocampal mossy fiber pathway. So don't worry about the brain areas if you're not a neuroscientist, but for hippocampus people, the mossy fiber pathway constitutes synapses from the dentate gyrus to hippocampal area CA3. And it operates, the plasticity in this pathway operates in the following way. It's very simple. If the presynaptic neuron activates, this triggers a very large increase in the effective synaptic weights from that presynaptic neuron onto postsynaptic neurons. And this lasts up to a few minutes in some experiments. And this is actually one of the best understood synapses in the entire brain because the synaptic terminals are giant. So you can really get in there and stick electrodes in there and really get a good sense of what's going on. And the mechanism of this is actually fairly well established. And what happens is that, so the presynaptic terminal, so the cell from the dentate gyrus, originally looks something like this with a few vesicles of neurotransmitter. And when this neuron is activated, what that does is it triggers the influx of a ton, sometimes up to thousands of additional synaptic vesicles into the axon terminal of this presynaptic neuron. And what this means is that the next time this neuron activates, it's going to dump out a bunch more neurotransmitter onto the postsynaptic neuron and therefore correspond to a much larger synaptic weight effectively. And again, this effect, these vesicles can stay, at least in some experiments, for a couple minutes, and maybe under other conditions, even longer. And so this is what is an example of what's called a one-factor rule, which means that it only depends on one signal, which is the activation of the presynaptic neuron. Okay, and so to go back to summing high-dimensional vectors, consider the case in which we have a bunch of these neurons all projecting or connecting onto, in this case, just one readout neuron. We'll talk about more readout neurons later. And let's say that for the sake of argument, in the beginning, all of these weights are very, very small. So our W vector is going to be 0. And now let's present our code word for A, which we'll consider the sparse binary case here. So A activates some subset of these neurons. And via this plasticity mechanism, that increases their weights onto the readout neuron. And so this W vector becomes identical to our code word RA. And this W vector lasts longer than the activation, so it stores the memory at least for a couple minutes. Now let's present RB. This activates another sparse set of neurons and triggers those neurons' synapses onto the readout neuron to potentiate. And this corresponds to adding RB to our W vector. So now W, which is the vector of these synaptic weights, is the sum of RA and RB. And now, for the sake of argument, let's say that we can turn off plasticity. And now we want to check which elements are in this set, which is encoded by W. So again, let's try present RA. And now we will activate a set of neurons corresponding to A that overlap or that align with the set of potentiated synapses. And so since these synapses are now strong, this, for the sake of argument, will produce an input that is strong enough to activate the readout neuron. So the readout neuron will say, yes, RA, or the element A was included in this set as encoded by W. On the other hand, if we present the code word for an element that was not included in this set, with very high probability, these activated neurons are not going to overlap very much with W, and the readout neuron will not activate, indicating that C was not in this set. And so the conclusion here is that these highly neuromorphic one-factor plasticity rules, which are even simpler than things like Hebbian rules, which I'll talk about in a minute, they can store subsets by summing high-dimensional vectors very well. And in fact, in the dentate gyrus, which is kind of the area where one would find these presynaptic neurons, that is thought to do this pattern separating operation that encodes information in these sparse distributed high-dimensional vectors. So this aligns very well with how this part of the brain operates. But all of this poses a natural question. So subsets are great, but how can high-dimensional vectors encode more interesting information structures, for instance, sequences? And in particular, how do we represent the ordering information in such sequences? And there are certainly a lot of interesting ideas about how to do this, many of which have come from this community. But we are going to focus in particular on operations that could correspond to plasticity mechanisms in the brain. So what plasticity mechanisms in the brain could support this kind of storage of ordering information? And this is highly relevant to episodic memory formation, since forming episodic memories often amount essentially to something like one-shot storage of sequences. And so that is kind of the main question that is going to drive the rest of this talk and that motivated this project. And before I get into details, I just want to tell you kind of the take-home message or the answer suggested by this talk, which is that in many or potentially all cases in the brain, one-factor plasticity or summing high-dimensional vectors is in fact all you need, which probably sounds quite counterintuitive. But the reason this might work is that quote unquote natural sequences have extremely strong priors. So for instance, event sequences in the world do not unfold in totally uniformly random orders. So if I gave you a bunch of frames from a movie clip, you could probably put them together in the right order with pretty good accuracy. And more importantly, sequences of brain activity have extremely strong priors on how they unfold. So for instance, kind of the modern picture of how population activity in cortex and other brain areas evolves over time is that it doesn't just hop around completely haphazardly, but it flows along or evolves along some semi-continuous or smooth activity trajectory, often constrained to some sort of low-dimensional subspace or manifold. And why this is important is that often in both the event sequences cases, but more importantly in the brain activity sequences, the set of states visited during the original sequence can fully determine the order of the sequence. And so if I just highlight a bunch of states visited by this activity trajectory, you can see that even if I get rid of the activity trajectory in the brain, you can very accurately put them back together or put back together the order in which they were visited just by connecting the dots. And I will also argue that this is a very brain-like type of operation, this connecting the dots thing. And this is because the sequence can be recovered by following the state sets with something like a repurposed odor tracking algorithm. So odor tracking algorithms are extremely ubiquitous across the animal kingdom and very well studied in brain and behavioral sciences. And this is basically all you need to follow this little trail of breadcrumbs, if you will, that encodes the activity trajectory. And so the significance of this is that potentially in a lot of cases, if you want to store a complex sequence, you don't actually need any Hebbian plasticity or attractor networks, which are kind of the dominant picture. This will also provide an intuitive interpretation of some non-traditional, still somewhat enigmatic plasticity rules, but which are gaining a lot of empirical support in the last decade or so. And it also suggests that episodic recall, episodic memories are not going to be stored perfectly, which is how they're often modeled as being stored in neuroscience. But in fact, the recall process is highly reconstructive and possibly biased by very strong priors. And actually, some of our friends and colleagues over at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton recently did a study where they gave people scrambled stories. And in fact, people recalled the stories in the original order, even though that is not how they were presented. And something I'll get into at the end, if I have a bit of time, is that this kind of idea suggests a new form of a biologically plausible episodic reinforcement learning algorithm. So that's the take-home message for the whole talk. One factor of plasticity may be all you need. Okay, so just a quick outline for the rest of the talk. I will first just go over a little bit about episodic memory and how people think about it in the neuroscience community. I will present the model in more detail about how all this works, and in particular introduce a type of HD code that we have termed a path vector, which is a high-dimensional vector that encodes a path through some graph or manifold or state space. I'll go over some of the things you can do with these so-called path vectors. I'll present a new interpretation of one of these particularly strong yet enigmatic and recently discovered plasticity rules in the hippocampus called behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity. So this is in addition to the mossy fiber plasticity rule, that it happens one layer downstream in the brain. And if I have a bit of time, I'll talk about some of the computational properties of path vectors and why, even regardless of their relationship to the brain, they may be very useful representations. So to dive in. So what are the key properties of episodic memory that are relevant for today? So first, a very kind of squishy definition, although we will make the definition of what an episode ought to mean more precise in a moment. But the main takeaway, or the main thing here, is that we're going to consider episodes that are sequential in nature. So things like walking to a new restaurant, having a conversation with a friend, things that unfold in time. And these types of memories are often formed after only a single experience, so in a one-shot manner. So many times many times a conversation or typically a conversation with a colleague in the hall will just happen once rather than repeating it 30 times, which is something that's more typically studied in the laboratory with these like mini trial experiments. Episodic memories in the natural world are often formed in a single shot. A corollary of that is that it is widely thought that such one-shot formation of episodic memory requires plasticity mechanisms that are both immediate and enduring. So they happen very quickly and they last for a while. And it's important for health reasons because episodic memory is impaired in a number of neurological disorders, such as Alzheimer's. And more generally, episodic memory underpins diverse behaviors and even many social institutions. So things like communication, witness testimony, education, information transmission through social networks, and so forth, all depend on this one-shot episodic memory formation. And finally, something that is well known in the psychology community, but is less studied in neuroscience, is that episodic memory can be extremely inaccurate, even in healthy individuals. There are a number of studies showing that people, they can have their episodic memories manipulated falsely very easily, or they introduce things like cultural biases when they reconstruct them. Okay, and now into the typical models of episodic memory that people study in neuroscience. And the main thing is that episodic memory models tend to be dominated by the theory of Hebbian plasticity. So just as a brief review, Hebbian plasticity is the theory that, or the mechanism described by neurons that fire together, wire together, and is extremely widely studied and very theoretically has a lot of theoretical support and is the origin of things like Hopfield networks, which won the Nobel Prize last year. And the basic idea is that if you have two neurons with a weak synapse and you stimulate them or they activate together, that will trigger a potentiation of that synaptic weight. And so this requires the coincidence detection between the presynaptic and postsynaptic activity. And everyone loves Hebbian plasticity because it's a very natural and intuitive theoretical mechanism for binding or chaining information or representations together. So if this neuron corresponds to the bell and this one corresponds to the steak, it's a very kind of natural way for a brain-like way for these two representations to get bound together, literally through a synapse that connects one set of neurons, or synapses that connect one set of neurons to another. There's also a ton of in vitro evidence for Hebbian plasticity. In particular, spike timing dependent plasticity, which was discovered in the late 90s, this adds an additional ordering dimension to Hebbian plasticity, such that the plasticity mechanism observed in these Petri dishes reinforces the order of activation. So this only occurs if the presynaptic neuron spikes before the postsynaptic neuron. And then finally, it's very theoretically appealing. There's a lot of detailed mean field theory work on all of this. And it's widely known that Hebbian plasticity can produce networks that do this very important operation of pattern completion. And in this case, in Hopfield networks, this is done through fixed points. And there's a variation of Hopfield networks such that Hebbian plasticity with an asymmetric part can produce sequences. So this is very, very widely studied and very kind of compelling as a theory for how information could get bound together in sequences. But there is a problem with Hebbian theory. As beautiful as it is, the Hebbian plasticity mechanisms operating in the brain are not necessarily immediate and enduring. And in particular, most experiments suggest that Hebbian plasticity or spike timing dependent plasticity is quite slow, requiring many, many repeated trials of this kind of sequential activation of the neurons. And it's still actually unknown whether Hebbian plasticity is even significant in vivo. What is known, or beginning to be known with more detail, is that the plasticity mechanisms that have this immediate and enduring quality and are thought to operate in vivo, which these do exist, but they are generally not Hebbian. And so one example I discussed just briefly, or just a moment ago, is in the mossy fiber pathway. So this plasticity mechanism is very fast and strong and enduring, at least for a couple minutes. And it depends only on presynaptic activity. Uh, Another plasticity mechanism that's very strong and fast in the hippocampus, which has been named behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity, is kind of like a small perturbation to the mossy fiber plasticity rule, which it depends on presynaptic activation and not postsynaptic activation, but rather the activation of a third signal that comes from another neuron. And so this, it does have a bit of coincidence detection going on, but it's not your traditional Hebbian theory. And it's very exciting and starting to be well established, but we don't really understand what it does or how it encodes information yet. And so the kind of neuroscience motivated question behind the rest of this talk is how can these non-Hebbian rules, which don't seem to be intuitively lined up for sequence storage, how can they encode episodic memories and how can they encode sequential and associative information? So let's move on to the model. So the model we introduced in this paper is based on an object we've called path vectors. And the way of thinking about this is the following. So consider this extremely oversimplified model of the brain, but which is hopefully still useful. On the left, we have a so-called neocortex or neocortical-like region, and on the right, a hippocampal-like region. And this is kind of the framework that has been put forth in a theory called complementary learning systems theory, which is all about having fast and slow learning in different parts of the brain so they don't deleteriously interfere with each other. Okay, and then in the neocortex part, we're going to consider what neural activity patterns look like. So these will be indexed or defined by vector U. So each axis here represents the activity pattern of some neocortical neuron. And a key observation, which is now widely established, is that this activity does not lie all over the place and fully fill up this space. It is generally thought, at least in kind of these constrained tasks, and possibly in very naturalistic settings too, that neocortical activity is strongly constrained to a lower dimensional subspace or manifold, meaning that yes, it does move around and encode stuff, but it is generally going to be stuck to some lower dimensional manifold. And so this puts a strong constraint on the type of activity patterns that neocortex can produce. And what this means is you can actually bring, if the manifold is 2 dimensions, for instance, you can just plot the activity on the manifold down here as a sort of simplified representation of what's going on that you can visualize. And so we do have follow-up work on doing all this stuff in continuous state spaces and dynamical systems. But in this study and in this talk, we are going to continue the discretized version of this. So we're going to consider activity patterns in neocortex that can have discrete sets of activations. And part of kind of complementary learning systems theory and other ideas that are related to this is that neocortex is thought to do this kind of slow learning of a model of the world, or like the statistical structures of the world. And in particular, not this episodic business, but to learn kind of overarching environmental statistics. And so in the model, we said, okay, let's suppose that the patterns of activity on this discretized manifold or state space correspond to something like states in a world model. So in this case, if this world model is very simple, it's just a grid world. And each one of these boxes corresponds to an activity pattern, which corresponds to a specific state in this grid world. All right, and now we are going to add our hippocampus. And the way we do this is by connecting the neocortical representation to hippocampus through just a random feed-forward network. So no learning involved at all. And you can tune the number of layers on this depending on how the details you want to play with. But the basic operation this network has is to perform a pattern separating operation. And what this means is that even though the neocortical activity patterns are highly structured and correlated and have all this geometric organization, when you pass them through this pattern separating network, and this is kind of the first order picture of how people think the dentate gyrus actually works. When you pass them through this network, it decorrelates or orthogonalizes the neocortical states such that each one of these green vectors maps to a almost orthogonal vector in hippocampus, where R now indicates the hippocampal activity. And so we have this two system thing going on where neocortical activity is very geometrically organized, but it's passed through this dentate gyrus like pattern separating network that orthogonalizes all of the codes so that hippocampus has orthogonal non-interfering versions of these codes. All right, and now we are going to consider the semi-realistic scenario in which this is happening in the brain of some agent, and the agent is moving around its world and updating its internal world model representation. And in the real world, you can't teleport at will, unfortunately. You usually have to take steps to states that are adjacent physically to where you are. So when you move through the world, you might trace out some sort of path like this. And kind of the main conclusion of this talk is that if each of these states get passed through this pattern separating network, and then we apply this plasticity rule that is memorizing the set of these states, all of these states will get encoded in this vector of potentiated synaptic weights called W. And because this vector is encoding the set of states that were visited, you can simply go through all possible states and check whether each one of these states was included in W in this set or sum. And what this means is that W effectively represents this exact same path that was taken as the agent traveled along this trajectory through the world. And for that reason, we call W a path vector. So W corresponds to this set of weights, and what it is isomorphic to, at least with very high probability, is the path through the world model that was taken during this episode. And one interesting thing is that this type of encoding mechanism introduces a new type of error. So say the path crossed itself and has what I have called a branch point or an intersection. This will introduce ambiguity. So if you're trying to recall the path from the vector W, using our, the sum of HD representation storing subset idea, when you get to this state, you're not going to know which way to go. And so at first glance, it seems like this is highly limiting, but I will show later that actually this kind of thing occurs much less than you might think, especially when you go into slightly higher dimensional neural activity manifolds. And so these branch points are less of a problem than one might imagine. All right, and so that is the overarching model for how to store sequences with this one-factor plasticity rule by leveraging the constraints of the structure of neocortical activity and the corresponding topology of the world model. This allows you to store all of this path, which implies more or less the sequence, in a single vector W using a very simple one-factor plasticity rule. And just the math is very simple. So if the states are here, S1, S2, all the way up to time t, their neocortical codes are U1 through UT. Their hippocampal codes are just this random network, which does this pattern separating operation applied to the neocortical codes. And then the path vector is just the sum of these hippocampal representations. And you can see more about this in the paper, but you can also add in a decay timescale so that you don't fill up all of your synaptic weights, but can let them decay away so that you can restart your memory storage anew at a later time. So that's the encoding. And for decoding or retrieval, the way of doing this is to loop over time steps. And at each time step, when you're at a specific state in the world model, you do something analogous to sniffing all of the candidate states that are downstream from your current state. And sniffing means taking the dot product of your high dimensional code for a candidate state with the path vector. And since high dimensional sums can store subsets, what you will find is that this dot product will be close to 1 if the state was visited, or higher if it was visited multiple times, and close to 0 if it was not visited. And so this is very strongly analogous to detecting whether there is an odor here or an odor there. And the rule is that if you detect a quote unquote virtual odor corresponding to this dot product being about 1, then you advance to that state. And then you repeat the process, basically following this trail of odors or of breadcrumbs through the state space and thereby reconstructing the path. And one thing that is interesting here is that you only have to check the downstream states. So unlike trying to pull the set, a subset of 3 items out of a total set of 10,000 items, you don't have to check all 10,000 items. You only have to check the states that are downstream of your current state, which can be quite fast. All right, so that is how the model basically works. Now I'll talk about some of the capabilities of this type of model. So we ran a bunch of simulations after working out this theory. And here is just an example of storing and recalling paths through a very simple kind of grid world-like model. And so consider here a 2D grid world represented in purple and its neocortical representation, which corresponds to this plane in green in your neocortical space. And we're going to suppose that the agent took a sequence like this, or some sequence of steps through this world model state space. And in this case, we're going to assume that the agent did not come back and bump into its previous states so that there are no intersections or branch points. And here's what happens when you actually run the code. So you can store this trajectory in the path vector. And then in this case, it is recovered exactly correctly. And you can also store this trajectory in the path vector, and it is recovered correctly. And you can do this for many more trajectories. And just to be clear, in this simulation, we are only storing one trajectory at a time. But one can, I can discuss more later how to store multiple trajectories. But the case here is, how do you encode a complex trajectory, in this case, a path through this 2D state space, in one shot using these kind of realistic brain-like plasticity rules? And here's just some statistics. So you might have guessed that the number of states you can store increases with n, and it increases linearly. That's, I think, a fairly well-known fact from both the Bloom filter literature and the VSA literature. So here you can see that as you increase the dimensionality of this representation, you're able to store longer trajectories and recover them accurately. So this is the mean similarity between the stored and the decoded or recovered trajectory. So it increases with n, as you might expect. We don't have to limit ourselves to just grid worlds, though. So we can really let this operate on fairly arbitrary state spaces. So that's what's depicted here. And here's just some more statistics. We ran the exact same simulation, instead of on a grid world, on a 3 regular directed graph. So maybe this is the world model corresponding to a simple Wikipedia or something. And we let this world model be randomly embedded in the neocortical space. And again, you can see that your ability to recover the trajectories or sequences on this graph increases with your number of neurons n. One note is that this doesn't actually have to be randomly embedded. It could have a lot of geometric structure to it. And then when you pass these codes through the pattern separating network, that allows them to be distinguished and decoded from the path vector. But there's one more quite important point here. And so that is that your recall accuracy depends, yes, on n, the number or dimensionality of the hippocampal neural representation, if you will, but it also depends on the structure of the state space, or equivalently, the neocortical manifold. So one way of increasing the probability that you will recall the sequence perfectly is to just add more neurons. But because of this branch point situation and paths bumping into each other, you're going to hit a limit where there are just certain paths, or it's going to be less and less likely that a long trajectory will be perfectly unambiguously decodable. However, what you can do is to change the world model or the state space or this neocortical manifold. And I won't go into the details about how I did this for this specific simulation, but it's more or less just embedding it or having a higher dimensional and sparser world model. But if you do this, if you change the world model, you can drastically increase your ability to recall typical sequences through it. So accuracy of recalls depends on both N and the world model in which these sequences unfold. And one thing that's fairly kind of nice about this type of representation is that we can now abstract away a bit from the physical neural or synaptic trace and instead start reasoning about episodic memory in terms of paths alone. So since the path vector is isomorphic to a path through a world model, which is why it was named that, now we can forget about the neural part of this and ask questions that are more high level or cognitive, if you will, which is what is the neocortical or the world model state space? Which states are stored during the episode? Are they all broken up? Do they actually trace out a path? Do they cross each other? And corresponding to this, will recall succeed or will it fail in potentially interesting ways? And so one example is how do you use this mechanism? So at first glance, it seems like this mechanism can only encode, already kind of pre-existing natural paths. So how do you encode something like serial order, which is what a lot of these other kind of episodic memory models and a lot of kind of psychology studies are based on? So how do you encode something like ABC and distinguish it from ACB? And so I'm not going to go into details about how the neocortical activity manifold is learned or how the world model is learned. There's a whole area of research about that, but we're going to assume that it has somehow been learned already. And this already represents a constraint in the neocortical space at the time of memory formation. And we're going to assume that some of these states correspond to, say, A, B, and C, which would be the items we're actually interested in encoding. So say you're trying to remember your two-factor authentication code. How do you store that quickly using a path vector? And the basic idea is that when one presents this sequence, that would generally be expected to produce some smooth-ish neural activity trajectory along this manifold. And in this case, we'll assume that it actually goes through these states, but connects them in order with a unique or semi-unique path. And because this trajectory is roughly isomorphic to the set of states it stores, this sequence ABC can be represented by a set of states that connect these three items in the proper order. On the other hand, if we were to store ACB, we would have a path that looks something like this, going through A, then C, then B. And once again, this corresponds to a set of states, again, which can be encoded by summing their high dimensional codes. And this set of states connects A, C, and B in a distinguishable order from A, B, and C. And so this is kind of a first order approximation of how one might encode arbitrary serial order using this mechanism. And I want to emphasize that this is not necessarily the only way of doing this. There's a lot of cool studies about like working memory representations in prefrontal cortex and attractor dynamics. But this shows how, in fact, the path vector mechanism and these one-factor plasticity rules can do this in hopefully a somewhat natural sounding way. And here's just some more statistics, which more or less show that your ability to store items serially in such a manner increases as the dimensionality of your neocortical space increases. So if you're just in a two-dimensional space, pretty quickly you're going to start crossing over the path and bumping into each other, and that will introduce ambiguities when you recall this sequence of states. But as soon as you're in like 8 dimensions, even if you have 30 items you're trying to link together, the chances that the path is going to bump into itself again get very, very small. And so a few more dimensions really, really help you out in decreasing the number of branch points and therefore increasing your ability to store sequences. And I think this is actually, well, a hypothesis is that this is related to things like mnemonic devices, where, you can, if you've ever read Moonwalking with Einstein, which is all about improving your short-term memory, the way these memory athletes are able to memorize a whole deck of cards in order is by mapping it to some other, say, story or like walk through some landscape, in which they are able to encode or cognitively encode the set of sort of arbitrary items or digits in a much more naturalistic way, such that they don't interfere via this story representation or spatial representation. So it's somewhat suggestive of how you could use this kind of mechanism to support things like mnemonic devices. Another example is, how do you bind pieces of information in kind of an associative way together with this mechanism? And again, it all depends on the geometry and organization of what your existing neocortical activity space is. And so here is just kind of for the sake of argument, we'll assume that you do have a fairly developed neocortical space where you have some states within this space corresponding to positions and some states corresponding to items. And then the way to encode these in the path vector is to just store paths that connect specific locations on your physical position representation embedding to other locations in this neocortical space. Sorry, I changed it to Z here, but that should be U. This neocortical space that represent these items. And so now we have a link from, in this case, xy comma 1 or xy sub 1 to the item A, and xy sub 2 to the item B. And so this binds B to xy2, and it binds A to xy1. And since all of these states are represented by roughly orthogonal vectors and the paths don't cross, this will uniquely encode the binding. And the way you recall is that you would start from one of these positions, say xy1, follow the steps, and the distance to your item A decreases until you get to A. And similarly, if you start from xy2, the distance to item B decreases until you get to B. And to perform the reverse binding, you instead would draw a path from xy1 to B and xy2 to A. And again, in higher dimensions, these are much less likely to bump into each other. So your ability to do this increases when you increase the dimensionality of your neocortical space. Meaning that you can use path vectors in this way to store associative and sequential information, even though at the end of the day, we're only actually summing together high dimensional vectors in the brain through this one factor plasticity rule in the model. Another question this raised, and this was one of Stefano's very large and interesting contributions to this paper, because he has a much stronger background in reinforcement learning, is, can this mechanism not just store episodes for kind of memory, but also support something like reinforcement learning and using these and the ability to use these episodes to learn how to navigate, say, a novel environment and find rewards in it? And the answer is yes. And the way to do this, we will have to introduce one more signal, but it is very simple and binary and doesn't require a lot of significant Hebbian-like coincidence detection, is to sum rewarded paths, meaning paths that lead to reward. And when you do this, you can create what is effectively a pretty good action policy that is very distinct from traditional reinforcement learning style policies. And the intuition here is that we said the set or the sum of states corresponds to the path. And if we sum or aggregate rewarded paths, we will be able to create a policy. And the way that one implements this policy and actually takes actions is by finding, so you wander around the state space till you find one of these paths, and then you follow the path. And just to be precise about what I mean, suppose now we're back to some grid world, and one of these states is a rewarded state. So when you get here, you get a reward. And here's our path vector over here or our potential path vector over here on the right. But now we're going to add in one more signal, which will be a signal that encodes whether the reward was received. And this could be done, rewards are very often thought to have to do with neuromodulators like dopamine. There's subtleties there, but let's say for the sake of argument, you have some maybe neuromodulator mediated reward signal that kind of covers the whole set of synapses here. And the function of this reward is going to be to convert a short-term path vector to a permanent path vector. And so this is something people think neuromodulators actually do. They convert short-term synaptic changes to long-term synaptic changes. And the idea is the following. Say you take this path, you don't get to a reward, creates a path vector temporarily, but you don't get to a reward, and so you just let it fade away. So if this were like in the mossy fiber pathway, you would just wait a couple minutes and it would fade away. On the other hand, say you take a path that does lead to the reward. Again, we create this short-term path vector, but now we get the reward signal. And what this does is converts the short-term path vector to a permanent path vector. And so these get burned in and last much longer, maybe via the trafficking of ion channels into the synapse or something like that. We can do this again. Say another path leads to the reward state. This will create another path vector, and the reward gets activated and gets this triggers the conversion of that short-term path vector into a permanent path vector. And at the end of the day, what you'll end up with is a set of trajectories that led to the reward, and these are encoded in this permanent path vector. And so now instead of mapping a path to a vector, we've mapped a set of paths, or a little like trail network, to this single set of synaptic weights. And the policy, if you want to get to the reward using this, is to wander around until you encounter one of these paths, and then follow the path to the reward state. And yes, you might end up going the wrong direction, but more often than not, or maybe 50% of the time, you will end up going in the right direction and you will get to the reward. And so we simulated this, and you can see that actually this does work pretty well. It's maybe not the fully optimized way of maximally fast learning, but it is highly biological and it is quite good enough, if you will. And so after, in this case, this was a 10 by 10 grid world, I think. And after, say, 50 trials, you get pretty good at navigating to the reward very quickly, and at least getting there every time. And I just want to contrast this with traditional pictures of biological reinforcement learning. So most reinforcement learning is based on this concept of value, which tells you more or less how close you are to a reward state. It has a lot to do with the dopamine system. It's a whole very interesting story. The policy is to follow the value gradient. And so you would just go uphill until you get to the highest value state, which would have the reward. In the path vector example, however, this is a reinforcement learning style that is based on a set of paths. And the policy here is to find and follow paths. And this, we haven't done a bunch of detailed simulations quite yet on this, but this may have the advantage that if you are actually trying to pull out signals in the brain and you're trying to decode these very subtle value gradients from noisy spike trains, that could be a very difficult thing that would require either a lot of neurons or a long integration time to be able to distinguish this yellow from this slightly darker yellow over here. Whereas when you're following paths, it's only a binary detection that you need to do, which requires much less integration time and potentially fewer neurons as well. So it could be a much more noise robust way of implementing a policy. All right, I still have 10 minutes, so I want to quickly go over what kind of interpretation this suggests for this very interesting, very modern plasticity rule called behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity, which was discovered about 10 years ago, but has been very well established in hippocampus. Yeah, so here's some papers if you want to look this up, including one of Wolfgang Maase's papers, which was very inspiring for subsequent work that I'm doing with some other folks. And so to motivate this, let's go back to our original picture. So we have a bunch of presynaptic neurons that connect to a readout neuron. But so far, we've just considered one readout neuron. But now let's consider the case in which we have a bunch of readout neurons. What does this do? And this is closer to the picture of CA3 to CA1 connections in hippocampus. And so when you have a bunch of readout neurons that are all doing the same thing, you more or less get the same kind of engram or encoding scheme, but just with a little more robustness. So maybe if a couple of readout neurons died, you would still be able to encode and decode this path. But here, with a bunch of readout neurons all doing the same thing, you still encode a path that you can decode with the mechanisms I was just discussing. But what has been discovered in hippocampus, in particular in these specific synapses, is this thing called behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity, which it was named for the timescale, but the details are, I think, the more important details are about its operation. And the effect of this is that at each time, in fact, only a sparse set of these CA1 readout neurons are plastic. And biophysically, this is thought to be controlled by this slow, approximately stochastic calcium spikes that occur in the dendrites of the CA1 neurons. And this is very kind of complicated in the biophysics. I mean, it's triggered by an instructive signal from entorhinal cortex. But what this means is that at any given time, only a subset of these neurons will be open for these weights to become plastic. And which neurons are currently plastic will change slowly over the time scale, at least in these mouse experiments, of about 5 to 10 seconds. And the 5 to 10 second time scale is why it was called behavioral time scale. Yeah, and so if we now link this empirical observation to the path vector model, what this means is that each state is not just stored in a set or a subset, but it becomes associated with a sparse vector of readout neurons that is changing over a time scale of like 5 to 10 seconds. And this is actually kind of similar to an idea of temporal context, which was introduced by Howard and Kahana a while ago, but also kind of the main idea that goes back even further, that there's some high-dimensional vector slowly moving around that encodes time. But if we go back to our visualization, a way of thinking about the operation or the effect of this plasticity rule then is that each state, if we're visiting, they say for 1 second each state will be bound to a set of readout neurons such that states visited at similar time points will have similar sets of readout neurons corresponding to colors here, but states that are visited at very distant time points will have totally different sets of readout neurons. So it's kind of like adding a color or another like dimension to this path representation of what this weight matrix is encoding. And one thing that's nice about this is that now you can cross the path again, and actually this would correspond to storing using another set of readout neurons a second time the state was visited. But because time has passed, you're using a different set of readout neurons, and now you can actually distinguish which way you should go depending on where you just were. And so this resolves some of the ambiguities if the path crosses itself. All right, and last, I just want to mention some kind of interesting computational properties of path vectors that I haven't looked into this in a lot of detail yet, but I'm very keen about trying to use these to train networks and do other kind of reinforcement learning things. So here's just a list of kind of some of the advantages. One, they're fixed dimensions, which is very common for vector symbolic architectures. It also independent of path length L. And we also have that states, paths, and policies all kind of live in the same vector space. So this would, in principle, benefit reasoning across data types. It's graceful failure, so there's no catastrophic failure like you would have in a typical hot field network. As you add more and more path or more and more states to the path, if you start hitting up against the number of neurons you have, you just kind of fade away slowly about your ability to navigate. This could support very large networks since the number of states grows exponentially with n once you get to large n. And one thing that I think is actually quite interesting is that, perhaps the most interesting part is that path vectors are metric preserving, or at least approximately, meaning that similar paths correspond to similar path vectors. So one can do the math about this, but this basically means that the dot product between two path vectors corresponds to how many states they share. And so as soon as you have some nice kind of smooth metric preserving representation, it makes learning and reasoning with those types of codes much more amenable to working well. You can also support algebraic operations. So summing path vectors corresponds to taking the union of paths roughly, and thresholding a sum corresponds to the intersection. And also something that I need to read this paper better, but I think something that might be true is that if you take the dot product of a path vector with something called, I think, a vector functional architecture from, I think, Fritz Summers' lab in this paper, I think this produces the integral of that function along the path, which would be interesting to look into in the future. Okay, I have a couple more minutes, so I just want to go over some tips and tricks for memory and learning that you can try at home if you want, that are motivated by this idea. One of them is in the short term, if you're trying to store an episodic memory, don't break the path, let your mental activity move along smoothly. Avoid branch points, so don't visit the same state twice. And in the longer term, you would want to learn a world model that is both large and complex and expressive and captures transition structures of typical experiences, so that's accurate. For communication and learning, say in the classroom, is strongly mediated by memory. And according to this model, its memory formation is mediated by the world model. So effective communication can be benefited by trying to understand the listener's world model first and then expressing your ideas in that world model such that your ideas align, or the thing you're trying to communicate aligns with a path through their world model. All right, so to conclude, how does the brain store sequences in episodic memory? The main take-home message of this paper is that one-factor plasticity is all you need, and summing high-dimensional vectors is enough. And this is because neural activity sequences have very strong priors, and the set of states often determines the path. This suggests that these fast in vivo plasticity rules, despite being kind of non-traditional, are actually a highly capable memory system. It also makes a prediction that episodic memories are highly reconstructed and possibly using someone's state space or world models. And so this has very kind of broad implications for things like witness testimony, communication, and so forth. Yeah, there's a number of future directions for interesting things to do, and I'll just leave up a couple of citations here. This is the paper I just described today. We've also just put up a preprint about kind of a dynamical systems version of this that has kernels and all of that kind of fun, more fun mathematics. And we also have a data-driven project that asks about sequence encoding in fruit flies, which has a similar spirit of the idea that summing neural activity is all you need, but also differs from this model in fairly interesting ways. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Rich, thank you very much for the great talk. So let's open the floor for questions. Maybe I can start with the one of my own. So while listening to your main part of the presentation, supporting this one-factor plasticity idea, I had this in mind. A possibility to encode sequences in different ways. I mean, that's you all know. And then you showed this slide with recent kind of findings in neuroscience. I mean, how this time is encoded in the past. So I wonder, how these two models actually coexist, so to say. Because to me, agreeing on the Volt model is kind of strong assumption. So you, rather than having this running time notion to encode sequences.
Yeah, so how do we reconcile those two ideas?
Mm.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really interesting question. So a couple observations are that, yeah, so the first one is I did make a strong assumption that the world model had been learned, but strictly speaking, you don't actually need that. So this mechanism works very well if you are an animal and you get dropped in a totally novel state space. In that case, instead of using your world model, you can just use the world itself. So if you're running around a novel environment, it still has these strong constraints that you can't teleport, but have to take, individual steps. And so you don't actually need to learn the world model for this to work fairly well. And actually, someone in the temporal context vector lab sort of suggested this because she asked if this could happen in insects, which I thought in episodic memory in insects was kind of crazy. But actually, the insect mushroom body operates a lot like this too, and is very well suited, I would argue, for storing a set of states in the actual world that are visited by the insect, in which case recall corresponds to retracing those states. Um, the second part is that this behavioral timescale synaptic plasticity mechanism, it's been kind of mysterious for the last few years, but people are starting to connect it to temporal context, which is kind of widely studied, and it's a very strong hypothesis from the psychology literature. And temporal context means that you're like binding items to these temporal context vectors. Um, but there is, and so that allows you to sort of timestamp the memories to keep track of them so that they don't interfere. And so the main observation here, well, one thing there is that it's a bit the argument in the typical temporal context model is that if you're given an item, this activates a temporal context, and then you can find the nearby temporal context to find nearby items.
Mm.
But they rarely propose an actual neural mechanism for how that is done. And so the key kind of idea here is that by leveraging the topology of the state space of the world model, or maybe some other state space, you're actually kind of moving around in your neocortical space to get to the next item. And it's more of this like test about whether the next item's temporal context is similar to the current temporal context,
Mm.
rather than having a function that takes in the existing temporal context and spits out the next item. So for the latter, people often assume that there are these other connections from hippocampus back to neocortex, but that allow you to decode the temporal context, that allow you to decode the next item from the next temporal context. But it's unclear whether one could learn those kind of reverse connections at the same time. And so here, the kind of key idea.
But at the same time, you can, well, maybe I need to read this related neuroscience papers more, but I don't see principal difference from, I mean, purely from encoding this context. So, yeah, and the
Mhm,
effect
mhm,
on your neural architecture. So it just requires like generation of random. It's another randomized network, so to say.
mhm, mhm. Yes, that's right.
Um, uh, so,
Yeah,
yeah.
I do
What is
think
the
that
principal difficulty?
I do think the temporal context idea, yes, and it can be it's a first order encoded as a random vector, also with a potentially kind of pattern separating network. Um, And I think kind of the main sort of point I would like to make here is that one can even think of that as it's very useful, but it can also be thought of as a sort of second order effect. So one of the main points I am trying to make with this story is that even if you didn't have any temporal context, the structure of the state space or the world model, if you have one available, provides a ton of prior constraints for encoding the sequence. So one
Mm.
can imagine that this makes it kind of a much more robust memory model that you can use temporal context to improve your encoding and decrease ambiguities when you cross a path. But it's actually not strictly necessary to encode a very large number of sequences given the constraints imposed by the state space. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
definitely do want to
absolutely,
look into
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
this question. But
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So let me see if people have more questions in the audience.
If you don't mind, I would have a question.
sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was quite interesting. I have my background in AI mostly and some minimal education in neuroscience, but very minimal in comparison to this. So it was interesting to see some of these things I learned about back in the day, like the Hebbian learning and the episodic memory to come up in the hyperdimensional context. And now I was wondering, doing some of that overlap between AI and neuroscience that I had, we saw that a lot of these neural network-based methods are not so useful for modeling brain activity because they're still too deterministic. But there
Mm-hmm.
is this growing interest in spiking neural networks,
Mm-hmm.
especially for sort of potential wetware platforms, but that seems still to be a bit more far off.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel like does your approach here with HTC, which has some of these more neuromorphic properties, relate to that kind of approach? Do you
Like
feel like
networks.
one is more promising than the other, or do they just have like different potential uses?
Yeah, so that's a great tension I'm trying to keep in my head at the next stage of my scientific career, the spiking picture from the kind of rate coding sort of picture that's more aligned with high dimensional computing. So just a couple, I don't think I can fully answer this question, but a couple points that might be useful. If you check our paper, so we did do simulations in at least a rudimentary spiking network where we showed that if you put in traditional Hebbian plasticity rules that are based on spike timing, they're a lot less robust because you need a lot of precision in the spikes. Whereas if the only thing you're doing is basically integrating neural activity, even if you have very irregular Poisson distributed spikes, it's much easier to count spikes than it is to do coincidence detection between spikes. So I think this kind of mechanism is more robust to spiking noise. The second thing I would mention is that so I also do very much love spiking networks, and one of the things I'm thinking a lot about is how do you actually like create this neocortical space that has this manifold and can like have slow timescales and attractors and things like that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done about things like working memory and slow timescales in spiking networks that would relate to the neocortical representation. So I would love to connect a spiking network of the neocortical representation and glue a hippocampus onto it. And I think that if one did that in the right way, you could kind of get the best of both worlds, maybe. Not that we know what the best of the spiking network world is yet, but I think those things could go together quite nicely.
That's interesting to hear. Then we'll
Thanks for
just
the
have to
question.
follow your work.
Thank you, Tim. More questions? So let's see. So it's either too late for European or too early for
Oh yeah, I guess it's already
or
the
it's a
evening.
lunchtime for the US listeners. But Rich, thanks a lot for the great talk. I see the time is 6 past 11 here in Europe. So we probably shall wrap up this
That's great.
webinar. Thank you once again for giving this talk.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's always great
Yeah,
to share this kind of
and
work with others.
so to the rest of audience, I see you in 2 weeks from now. So have a great
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone.
day. Bye bye.
Thanks, Evgeny.
Bye.
Bye.